What if the NATO alliance just quietly rewrote the rules of the Black Sea War without firing a single shot? Because that is exactly what happened in Ankara when Trump walked into the 2026 NATO summit and pulled off a move nobody saw coming. Before we go deeper, if this channel ever adds value to the way you understand world politics, take a second and tap that like button, smash subscribe, and share this with someone who still thinks Turkey is just a vacation country. Now back to the story. For the first time in 22 years, NATO gathered again in Turkish soil. The summit opened on July 7, 2026, at the Beştepe presidential compound in Ankara. Every headline, every closed-door session, every side conversation revolved around one war, the war in Ukraine. And behind the polished podiums and the cameras, Donald Trump was not watching Zelensky. He was watching Erdogan. Because Turkey is no longer a footnote in the alliance. Turkey is becoming the spine of the entire southeastern flank. More than 480,000 active personnel, the largest standing army in NATO after the United States, and the only alliance member that can put its hands on the lid of the Black Sea whenever it wants. Look at where Turkey sits on a map and the picture becomes impossible to ignore. The country stretches across the narrow corridor that links the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Whoever controls that corridor quietly controls the energy routes, the military routes, the trade routes, and the political routes of the entire region. Turkey sees this clearly, and so does Trump. So does Moscow. So does Beijing. Everyone reads the same map. Turkey just learned to charge rent for being on it. By day 2 of the summit, Erdogan was already promising fresh military support for Ukraine. He framed it inside a national framework using domestic reserves, signaling that this was not NATO paperwork politics. This was Turkish soil, Turkish equipment, Turkish commitment. At the same time, Erdogan reminded everyone that the line to Putin had never gone cold. That phone still rings. And then he dropped a name that made the whole room go quiet. He said he was ready to host a trilateral meeting between Zelensky, Putin, and Trump on Turkish soil inside the alliance. With no preconditions, that single sentence is what triggered everything. Washington did not read it as diplomacy. Washington read it as an opening. And Trump made his move. He lifted the long-standing CAATSA sanctions on Turkey, the ones that had been biting since December 2020, when Turkey acquired the Russian S-400 air defense system. On paper, this looked like a reward for Erdogan. In reality, it was a message addressed to Moscow, loud, precise, and impossible to misinterpret. Let's rewind and look at why this hit so hard. Back in 2014, Russia annexed Crimea and did something deeply strategic. It parked S-400 air defense systems, Bastion anti-ship missile batteries, Panzer short-range systems, and electronic warfare units across the peninsula. Together, they form a layered denial shield that covers almost the entire airspace and sea space of the Black Sea. Conventional jets do not fly easily into that envelope. NATO air power has been effectively boxed out of the region for years. Russia's southern flank felt untouchable. Crimea became the unsinkable aircraft carrier Moscow always dreamed of, bristling with radar and ready to turn every runway and range into a no-fly zone. Then came the F-35, a fifth-generation stealth aircraft designed to slip under exactly these kinds of layered radar networks. The very jets that were supposed to come to Turkey but never did. Because when Turkey bought the S-400 from Russia in 2017, the United States punished the purchase by canceling over 100 F-35 deliveries and expelling Turkey from the program entirely. Turkey, the second largest military in NATO, was locked out of its most advanced air platform. Moscow celebrated this privately. It had quietly stolen a NATO ally's air advantage on its own frontier. And now Trump walked into Ankara and threatened to undo that entire Russian victory with a single signature. That is not an exaggeration. The F-35's stealth profile, its sensor fusion, its electronic warfare suite, and its network-centric data links make it the one aircraft on Earth that can survive inside the Russian shield over Crimea. It can hunt Russian surface ships in the Black Sea. It can degrade Russian coastal radar. It can locate and strike the S-400 launchers themselves. It can poke holes in the air defense network that Moscow spent a decade building. By restoring the F-35 path for Turkey, Trump puts that capability in the hands of the one NATO member that lives closest to the fight. So when Russian planners in Moscow run their war games this week, they are staring at a future where stealth aircraft fly from Turkish bases on missions their S-400 systems were simply not designed to survive. But the F-35 is only half the story. The deeper move sits inside the engine bay. Trump also opened the door to American-made F-110 GT engines. That engine is not just an upgrade. It is the lifeline of the F-16 fleet Turkey already flies, and it is the heart of Turkey's most ambitious national project, the KAAN, the fifth-generation fighter Turkey is trying to build inside its own borders. In June of 2026, the United States moved to approve the export of General Electric F-110 engines for the CAAN Block 10 program. Turkey already possesses 10 of those engines for flight testing. Without the F-110, the early CAAN prototypes do not fly at full performance. With it, Turkey gets a ready-made air force on the modern edge, plus a self-made jet that may soon join it on the runway. Lift one sanction, and you double a country's strategic weight. That is the math Trump just did. Now, of course, none of this is automatic. Congress still has to approve the transfer. The United States ambassador has already stated publicly that Turkey must meet strict S-400 conditions before the path is fully cleared. Trump can move fast, but he cannot move alone. The optics around the S-400 ARE is still complicated, and the Russian systems remain parked inside Turkish territory, turning every congressional hearing into a debate about NATO-Russian hardware sitting on a NATO base. But the direction is no longer in doubt, and that direction is the actual story. So why now? Why would Washington hand Turkey this much power at this exact moment? Because the message is not for Erdogan. The message is for Putin. And to understand what that message really says, we have to look at the single most powerful weapon Turkey has been holding since 1936, geography, and a treaty most people have never read. If you have made it this far, you clearly care about the deeper stories the news never covers. Drop a comment below telling me which country you think Russia fears most right now, and let us build this conversation together with real people who think deeply about geopolitics. Hit subscribe if you have not yet, because the next videos are going to break down even more of these quiet power moves. Let's keep going. Russia has spent centuries chasing one obsession: warm water ports. Open seas that never freeze. Access to the world's oceans without asking anyone's permission. The Black Sea has always been the crown jewel of that dream. It is Russia's gateway to the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and Africa. It is the southern lung of Russian power. Without it, the Russian Navy is bottled up behind Arctic ice for half the year and locked inside inland waters for the other half. Shipyards, fuel pipelines, naval aviation bases, even the prestige projects like the Kuznetsov class, they all assume one thing: that Russia can put hulls into warm water. That assumption lives or dies in the Black Sea. But the Black Sea is a closed bowl. There's exactly one way out: two narrow straits, the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. And the master of those two gates has been Turkey for almost 300 years. That is not a metaphor. That is a formal arrangement written into international law in 1936, and never seriously challenged since. Stop and let that sink in. Russia's entire Black Sea fleet can only reach the open ocean by passing through waters controlled by a NATO country. Every cruiser, every submarine, every supply ship Russia wants to send to the Mediterranean has to ask Ankara for permission. This is not a metaphor. This is a hard geographic fact, and Putin knows it better than anyone alive. It is also the reason Russia spent 8 centuries trying to take Constantinople. It is also the reason it never fully succeeded. And it is why, every single year, Russian naval planners build their war scenarios around one invisible question: will Turkey let us through? Now layer the legal structure on top of that geography. The 1936 Montreux Convention gave Turkey full authority over who passes through the straits in wartime. In peacetime, commercial traffic moves freely. Merchant. But once a war begins, Turkey gets a very different power. It can restrict, or even fully block, the passage of warships belonging to non-Black Sea powers, exactly the category Russia falls into when it is fighting inside the Black Sea. After February 2022, Ankara used this power within days. The straits were closed to warships. Every naval flag was treated equally. There was no discrimination, but the result was devastating for one side. Because, as the war dragged on, Russia's Black Sea fleet started bleeding. Ukrainian drones and missiles chewed away at it month after month. Sevastopol, the historic crown of the Russian fleet, turned into a target. Patrol boats burned in their moorings. Landing ships were sunk in open water. Submarines got pushed back to harbor. By early 2026, roughly 30% of the Russian Black Sea fleet's combat strength had been destroyed or seriously damaged. Russia needed to bring in reinforcements. It wanted to move ships from the Baltic and the Mediterranean into the Black Sea. It discovered, very quickly, that the door Turkey controlled was shut. And because the same door was shut in the other direction, no outside power could project naval force into the Black Sea either. The war stayed geographically contained. The Black Sea did not become a NATO-Russia shooting gallery. And Turkey, without firing a single bullet, had shaped the battlefield more than most of the armies fighting on it. That is the power Montreux hands to Ankara, and that is the power Russia quietly hates. Because it means, on paper, Turkey can end the war by sea in a single signature. The straits staying closed has been one of the quiet reasons Russia never managed to recover naval momentum since 2022. And even when Russia moved its remaining hulls east to Novorossiysk, even there the fleet is no longer safe. Ukrainian long-range drones and missiles have shown they can reach it. The Black Sea has simply stopped behaving like a Russian lake. And here's where most analysts get the story wrong. They frame Turkey as a country caught between two worlds, too scared of Russia to act and too proud to follow Washington. But that framing misses the deeper truth. Turkey is not caught between two worlds. Turkey is the hinge those two worlds swing on, and Ankara has been quietly building leverage inside that hinge for over a decade. Let me show you what I mean. Turkey is far more than a gatekeeper. It is also a NATO country that has stood up to Russia on 3 different continents. In Syria, Turkish-backed opposition forces broke the siege of territory that Russian air power had protected for years. In Libya, Turkish Bayraktar drones kept the Tripoli government alive against Wagner-backed troops and Russian fighters streaking across the coast. In the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war, Turkish drones gave Azerbaijan the battlefield edge against Armenia, one of Russia's closest partners. Wherever Moscow reached in the last decade, it usually ran into Turkish hardware first. That is real combat experience. Almost no other NATO country has it in this volume, and almost no other NATO country has tested that hardware against Russian systems in live conditions. Behind that experience sits serious industrial muscle. Turkey runs the second largest military in the alliance, but the more interesting fact is its defense industry. Today, Turkish companies are global players in armed drones. One Turkish firm, Bayraktar, now holds close to 60% of the global export market for combat drones, and the chief has made it his mission to push Turkey to near 2/3 of the world market. Turkish drone exports alone hit $1.8 billion in 2024, with about 90% of that revenue coming from foreign buyers. The Bayraktar TB2 became a symbol of the early Ukrainian war when it destroyed Russian armored columns heading toward Kyiv in the first desperate weeks of the invasion. At a time when most Western countries would not even send lethal weapons to Ukraine, Turkish drones were already on the battlefield reshaping it. Since then, the support has only widened. Mine-resistant Kirpi vehicles, laser-guided munitions, heavy machine guns, body armor, communications gear. Bayraktar broke ground on a drone factory inside Ukraine near Kyiv with a planned investment of roughly $95 million and a build target of around 500 local jobs. Russia even struck that factory with missiles during the construction phase. Bayraktar kept building. That is not symbolic support. That is a strategic commitment Turkey has personally underwritten in blood and concrete. And the message it sends to Moscow is blunt. We are not visiting your war. We have invested in its outcome. And the rest of NATO has started to notice. Poland became the first NATO and EU country to formally buy Bayraktar drones. Defense talks between Warsaw and Ankara have deepened across multiple areas. Turkey is also joining alliance programs to develop NATO-compatible unmanned systems and setting up joint production lines with major European defense manufacturers. At the Ankara summit itself, NATO announced more than $50 billion in new procurement commitments and an explicit push to expand collective manufacturing capacity. Industrial cooperation was not a side note. It was the headline. Right here, allow me to pause the story. If you want the kind of analysis that does not just react to headlines, but actually explains the systems behind them, tap subscribe and turn on the bell. New videos drop every week. Share this with a friend who still believes geopolitics is just background noise. They will thank you for it after they watch it. Back to the narrative. Turkey's actions in the Black Sea itself complete the picture. In early 2024, Ankara set up a joint task force with Romania and Bulgaria to clear naval mines left over by the war. All 3 are NATO members. All 3 share a coastline. The mission made commercial shipping safer and quietly sent a signal to Moscow that the alliance was operational in the very waters Russia thought it owned. Turkey also runs regular maritime patrols in the Black Sea. It is building a new naval command structure based in Istanbul. Its homegrown Anka unmanned aircraft keep continuous eyes over the region. This is not symbolic presence, this is layered surveillance. It is persistent intelligence. It is the kind of activity that turns a coastline into a perimeter. There have been real moments when that vigilance mattered. In mid-2027, a Turkish cargo ship was directly attacked in the Black Sea. The Turkish Foreign Ministry condemned the incident with an unusually sharp official statement. For Ankara, the war is no longer something happening far away. It is now something that threatens Turkish-flagged ships, Turkish crews, and Turkish trade. That is the moment when an already firm policy gets sharper teeth. That is the moment when an alliance member stops being a concerned observer and starts behaving like a frontline state. So what is Turkey's actual strategy? It is not simple hostility toward Russia. It is something far more sophisticated, a calculated balance. On one side, Ankara keeps pragmatic relations with Moscow alive. Erdogan never cut the personal line to Putin. Turkey refused to join Western sanctions. Energy trade and tourism continued. Millions of Russian tourists still come to Turkish resorts every summer. A wave of Russian citizens who fled the war relocated to Turkish cities, especially Antalya and Istanbul. Economically, the two countries are deeply linked. Roughly 39% of Turkey's natural gas still flows from Russia, and the share of pipeline gas coming from Moscow is even higher. That dependency is real, and it is not strategic theater. It is a binding constraint on every move Ankara makes. But the open channel also gave Turkey something extremely valuable: the role of honest broker. In 2022, Turkey personally mediated the deal that unblocked the Black Sea grain corridor and pulled the world back from a food security crisis. That single negotiation made Erdogan a player in a way no NATO leader could match. He could speak to both sides without being seen as either Russia's friend or its enemy. At the same time, Turkey keeps a hard edge against Russian expansion. Weapons flow to Ukraine. The straits stay closed to warships. Turkish naval patrols continue in contested waters. And there is one policy line that Erdogan has never bent. He has never, not once since 2014, accepted that Crimea belongs to Russia. He repeats publicly that the peninsula must return to Ukraine. This is not just rhetoric. The Crimean Tatars, the original people of Crimea, are a Turkic nation with deep cultural and kinship ties to Turkey. For Ankara, Crimea is not an abstract border question. It is a family question. And behind that emotion sits hard strategic math. Whoever holds Crimea has the launch pad to dominate the entire Black Sea. Turkey wants the opposite: a balanced Black Sea, open to trade, free to navigate, not owned by one power. A Black Sea where ships of every flag can pass freely, where commerce flows, and where no single navy can dictate terms from a captive coastline. This is why the picture looks so strong from one angle. But looking only at the strong side gives an incomplete truth, because Turkey also carries real weaknesses that Moscow can still use. The biggest one is energy. Roughly 40% of Turkey's natural gas supply still comes from Russia. That kind of dependency does not disappear overnight. Turkey's first nuclear power plant, Akuyu, is being built and operated by the Russian state company Rosatom, with its first reactor unit preparing to enter its commissioning phase in 2026. That reactor is designed to deliver power for decades. Trade volumes between the two countries hit historic highs after the war began, making Turkey one of Russia's largest individual trading partners after China. The economic interweaving is real, and it shows up in rubles as well as in tanks. And Moscow has shown it is not shy about weaponizing that interweaving. Back in 2015, when Turkey shot down a Russian jet that violated Turkish airspace, the retaliation was sharp and immediate. Russian agricultural products were banned. Russian tour operators were ordered to cancel bookings. Tourism collapsed within days. Economics, pressure turned into pure statecraft. The memory of that period is still fresh inside the Turkish foreign policy establishment. Every direct confrontation with Russia carries an economic price tag, and Turkey's leadership knows exactly how fast that price tag can be inflicted. There is also the unfinished business of the S-400. Turkey still owns the Russian air defense systems. Until that question is resolved, the path to the F-35 is not fully clear. Congress will ask hard questions. The optics will be complicated. Trump can move fast, but he cannot move alone. And the S-400 batteries themselves are still sitting on Turkish soil as a permanent reminder of an old Russian bet. Still, the broader picture is tilting. In the last year, Ankara has begun reducing its energy dependence on Russia. Liquefied natural gas imports rose sharply, with spot cargoes accounting for as much as a quarter of total demand at peak moments in 2024 and 2025. For its second nuclear plant in Sinop, Turkey invited American and South Korean players to the table instead of Rosatom. It is diversifying its gas supply across multiple suppliers. Slowly, the structural balance is shifting. And that is exactly why Trump's move in Ankara lands so hard. The alliance is no longer just sending weapons. It is rebuilding the country that holds the geographic key. It is diversifying the energy backbone of the NATO country, sitting on Russia's maritime exit. But here's the part of the puzzle that nobody is talking about yet, and it is the part that should keep every Kremlin planner awake at night. Let us now zoom out to the larger picture, because that is where the real impact lives. All of Russian power in the Black Sea rests on one foundation, occupied Crimea, and that foundation is cracking under daily Ukrainian pressure. Tankers have been sunk, air defense nodes have been knocked out, Black Sea fleet bases have been hit hard. The fleet that once projected Russian power across the whole sea is now mostly hugging harbor, scattered across the eastern Black Sea and waiting out the war behind floating barriers. Russia's grip on the region is weakening month by month. Sevastopol no longer functions as the safe forward base it was designed to be. Logistics routes south of the Amalfi Peninsula are no longer safe by default. Even the symbolic headquarters of the fleet, The naval command in Sevastopol has not been a safe working location since Ukraine struck it with precision missiles more than once. Now imagine what happens when, on top of that pressure, NATO adds a second one at the same moment. A stronger Turkish air force armed with stealth aircraft and modern engines. A reinforced naval presence, faster drone supply lines, continuous surveillance. The two pressures stack. Russia gets a squeeze between a battlefield it is losing inside Ukraine and a NATO frontier it can no longer ignore on its southern flank. That is a pincer. And it is the exact nightmare scenario for the Kremlin. Because the Black Sea is not just a theater of war. The logistics that feed Russia's southern front in Ukraine run through Crimean waters and Crimean ports. Rail connections across the Kerch Bridge carry fuel and ammunition south. Coastal shipping moves reinforcements between ports. A Russia that loses the Black Sea starts losing the war's overall tempo. The initiative begins to slip. And as it slips, the political calculations in Moscow start to change. The cost of holding Crimea rises every month. The benefit of holding Crimea falls every month. And there is a deeper political consequence that almost nobody talks about. Crimea is not just a military asset for Russia. It is the story Putin tells his own people. The land grab in 2014 was framed as the correction of a historical wrong. If Crimea visibly weakens, if the fleet that protects it visibly retreats, if the shield that covers it visibly thins, that story stops working on the Russian street. That is, when the pressure inside the Kremlin starts to look very different from the pressure outside it. And that is when an opening for negotiation, a real opening, not a theatrical one, becomes possible for the first time in years. And here is where Turkey's mediator role becomes even more interesting. Because while Ankara is rebuilding the military balance, it is also the country that keeps the diplomatic door open. Since 2022, Turkey has brought both sides to the table several times. The talks hosted in Istanbul produced prisoner exchanges and humanitarian deals, even when they did not produce a lasting ceasefire. Just before the Ankara summit, Erdogan publicly said he was working to bring both sides back to the table again. The same country that is tightening the military grip is also the one offering a path out of the war. That dual position is what makes Turkey so unusual inside NATO. It fights and negotiates at the same time. It arms and brokers at the same time. It speaks Moscow's language and Washington's language in the same week. It sits on energy contracts that finance the Russian state, and it sits on the only legal authority that can bottle up the Russian fleet. And it is why Trump's move fits so cleanly into the larger strategy. Reinforcing Turkey means raising the cost of every Russian move in the Black Sea. It means pushing the Russian fleet further into harbor. It means making the Crimean shield more porous with every new stealth aircraft that flies out of a Turkish base. And it means doing this at exactly the moment Russia can least afford it. So who actually wins this new Black Sea game? The country that controls the straits. The country that has drones in the air, ships in the water, and a relationship on the phone with both sides of the war. That country holds the balance. And right now, that country is Turkey. And here's the line Moscow most fears. The next time Putin reaches for the Black Sea, he is not just dealing with Ukraine. He is dealing with Ukraine plus a NATO flank led by a country whose drones, warships, and engineers have already beaten his allies on 3 different frontiers. The trap is set. The lid is on top. And Trump just handed Turkey the keys to tighten it. If you stayed with me to the very end of this breakdown, you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Where do you see the Black Sea balance going next month, next year, next decade? Tap subscribe, send this to the one friend who still thinks NATO is sleeping. Hit the bell so you never miss an upload, and leave me one prediction about the next Turkish move that will catch everyone by surprise. I will see you in the next one.